today's video site. Nah, man. This is gonna be a historical dive into a very different game. You're looking at this and like this. My goodness, me, Angela Fries. What is this? Are you what? Okay, at this point, before there were bishops or queens, there were 4 military branches, and as I like to call it, Chaturanga. Oh wow, I can't say it. Oh my goodness. Basically, an old Indian word for 4 divisions. Doggone. Modern piece, Cha's name, and the ancient division, and the logic. Let us get started. The pawn, the padi, infantry, 4 shoulders, the original versions. They had no double step. They must grind forward 1 square at a time. That's a rule. To know only 1 pawn thrust per move. So pawn moves are way more important. Knight, Asvi, or the cavalry. Moves remained unchanged for 1,500 years. The only piece that can jump. The bishop, the Gaja, the war of the short-term leaper. Jump exactly 2 doggone squares diagonally. Your brushes are crushing but limited reach of elephant. Rook, rat, doggone chariot, long-range sniper artillery. Think about like a mortarman, or a freaking doggone think of freaking artillery barrage. Cannon. Explaining my positional view to the audience. I'm going to explain to you why I finally was able to apply my positional endgame sleeves logic. I played against this level 3 bot. He destroyed me like 5 times in a row. I fell for tactics because I traded too early, and I tried to play for tactics like a regular chess game, but I needed to play an endgame grind. So I go knight to c3. My opponent, this guy, to my knowledge, I'm going to do a history look after the end of the game. My opponent goes pawn to e6, trying to control the light squares, stopping my knight from jumping forward. I go pawn to e3, just making a symmetrical match, controlling the dark squares, saying, hey, you're going to control light squares, I control dark squares. Now, my opponent goes pawn to d6, going to a sort of hippocamel type setup. I immediately go knight to f3, simply developing another piece, fighting for the dark squares and light squares in the center with the minor pieces. My opponent immediately goes knight to f6. I immediately go d3, mimicking the same exact formation, but with an extra minor piece out. Pawns guarding all these light squares, pawns perfect in formation, very good pawn structure, I am just in 1 tempo above a minor piece. 1 tempo in development favor. My opponent develops the same things, 4-knight game with a hippo type setup of pawns. Now let us get back to my notes so I don't lose track. Now I'm going to this end game, and I'm going to say I played and I finally understood how to get back to my master competent professional level, or even I would say competent grandmaster level. I finally understood the mastery of tension. This game is not trading and tactic, it's tension, positional, long play, and forcing weaknesses of the pawns, and then using this trash piece, the doggone elephant, and saying, if you're going to go ahead and, I found a pawn weakness, I'm going to sack one of these the freaking elephants, down to hit one of these pawn chains, or force a pawn weakness that I can exploit to get this rook in the game. That was finally a figured out plan. So, let's go. Move 4, knight to a6, f6, pawn to e4. Now matching a symmetrical pawn opposite of a fielder defense type pawn structure. Now you're fighting with the center, pawn's fighting for squares. Knight is allowed to develop here now because of this pawn move, so I could have played a little bit more easily, but I felt that fighting for the light squares would be more appropriate because now my opponent wouldn't be as easily to make this pawn move, but it would be best to keep the tension. So my opponent goes to e5 and goes for opposite color pawn chain. My opponent decides to go like this, so I know that this would technically be his good elephant. This would be his bad elephant because he is stuck behind this pawn, so my objective is to stop this good elephant from doing damage. I'm going to call elephant because I do not remember how to say the name. I think it would, and I do apologize for that. So, now I'm finally starting to match symmetrical pawn structure, symmetrical tension, and I understand now that symmetry and drawishness is best. So I immediately go G to e3. Basically, think about it as the bishop moving 2 squares to e3, guarding this square, guarding this square. My opponent copies is the same. I immediately go G to h3, fighting for this light square. potentially going for an outpost in the future to force this pawn weakness if this rook ever were to move. My opponent immediately goes basically the minister or the freaking queen that can only move one square, so a secondary, I like to call it the secondary king, to put itself in a dark square, so it protects all these light squares, and the king goes to dark squares, and the king's going to slowly try to shift to one side of the board. I immediately do the same, mimic that, saying, hey, no, now I guard all squares. My knight guards the queen, the weak queen piece, the knight, king, pawn, and sort of that iron wall defense. My opponent immediately goes G4. I constantly think in my head, oh my goodness, my queen is 9 points of value, should I move it? And that's why I blundered a lot of times, because I forgot the queen could only use one square, not 10 billion squares. So I counter-strike, and I say, hey, if you want to go ahead and try to go for an advance and test me, I'm going to go put pressure on your H-pawn. So my opponent takes my queen, I capture back with the king. My opponent goes to G6, creating a weakness. I step back finally. Now I see a fianchetto set up, but this fianchetto cannot actually do its long-term damage and protect its pawn. So this elephant is a bad bishop, and it has a structural weakness that my potentially dark square elephant can invade it, potentially, if this rook was able to move. Now, as I'm going to continue, you're going to finally see how I was able to understand the mastery of tension and symmetrical structures. I built a weakness, forced a pawn to attack. I step back, saying basically it's like a think about like a spear trying to get thrown at somebody. You throw the spear, and the man tries to go for the counterattack, and you back up and grab your spear again. As an example, I recognize that drawish games had to sacrifice the piece, as you're going to see eventually, for double pawns for the opponent, which made their defense heavy and slow, allowing my king to outmaneuver them for many moves. I'm playing active king. The active king makes a difference, and that's why I always love, even like it's crazy as it, I love putting my king in the middle of the board and active at the end of the endgame. And also the Bharat awareness. I didn't waste time trying to find a modern check me, and I realized, okay, my opponent has one pawn left. I'm gonna just run down the board of my king, get direct opposition, flank opposition, and take that pawn. So, now, let's go into the strategic goals. I finally made a leap in playing standard tactical chess into mastering high-tension logic of Chaturanga and Gaja. I transitioned immediate captures to the deep anatomy of the chessboard and longer positional understanding and patience. The hardest part was I was losing the urge to trade pieces and trade knights and move from by simplifying greedy algorithm to a positional squeeze. In early years, I trade pawns and minor pieces way too quickly, and I was open for my opponents for the rook, and I got punished. I learned to hold the tension, keeping my pawn in the center without capturing. I suffocated the opponent's pieces. I forced my opponent to move first, creating weaknesses in their attempts before that they didn't exist before. Now it's going to be let us continue. My opponent goes rook to d8. I'm trying to gain semi-open access to this file, which is not really possible as of now. He has a 0.5 material. I immediately go to my elephant to g5, putting pressure on this queen, potentially wanting to trade off. Now, because this queen is just completely useless, it's not going to wander away. And also, if I take this queen, it shatters the king's safety. So even though I sacrifice one of these freaking things, I get to remove king's safety, which is the most important thing in the game. So my opponent goes a knight check to me. I move away. I freaking I go, wait, hold on, what the, hold on. Oh no, I go, my knight checks the king. I take the knight, my opponent takes back. I move my knight here to attack this weak pawn that is not defended as of immediately, and potentially trying to get just the king in check. And almost mate, but if my elephant was here, it would be checkmate, but not. So, my opponent goes pawn to d5, double pawns now. I immediately go with the check that I wanted to go with. My opponent moves this king. I immediately move my knight pass, grabbing an outpost, threatening this knight, be willing to trade. If need be, knight takes, pawn takes. Then queen to m to f6, trying to attack my elephant. But I counter check, and I sacrifice this elephant to get double pawns, get this isolated pawn, and I have double pawns, but they're working in my favor to restrict the king from getting activity. So I sacrifice my piece, make this fiend shadow pawn structure way worse. Pawn takes. I step back. It's now simply offering to simplify and gain a very main good pawn structure in the center. My opponent does not think because it would just be takes back, king get active, and then slowly use my rooks to climb up rook lift around the board. To rook lift around the board, and win the game. So my opponent goes king to d6. I go the Gaja d1 to go out this flank and to potentially try to fight for these dark squares and protect this dark square. My opponent immediately goes rook check. I step out the way of my king, get in safety. My opponent immediately goes queen to e5. I go pawn to c3, sort of Aristotelian style like pawn structure, trying to trade off this pawn and continuously open up files for my rooks. So pawn takes, b files open now, put pressure on this pawn, put pressure on this pawn, put pressure on these pawn islands with the rooks. Now it's the king and queen marching, trying to defend as many squares as possible. Guard this square, this square, this square. So basically guards all these squares, this square, which is a pretty good amount, and fighting for the center. And even though the king and queen are active, eventually my major pieces, the double freaking cheerily, are going to whelm and blow away. Now, I dealt the signature descent style, but it made my king almost impossible to attack. Understanding a corner anchor, moving my Raja or king to the corner. Next, obviously, the minister made a covering of all dark and light squares. Okay, diagonal steers, top the horse, and elephant jumps. And my knight outpost, as you saw, putting the I-style at the immediate d5 or f5 square, or you saw me put the d5 square, just choked out black space. I kept the evaluation draws until I found a perfect mode for the sacrifice, maintaining symmetrical structure until I was ready to strike. And then now you saw the search for sacrifice, double pawns, pawn islands, isolated pawn, all type of pawn problems for my opponent. And we are equal material, but he has better king activity and queen activity, but these pieces are so weak that it doesn't even really matter. So, this is going to be with the endgame. I showed elite endgame stamina. I'm currently over, I believe this game was almost a 90 move game, because I took all the pieces in one. So now, as we're going to continue, tick, 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 boom, 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 bang, bang, boom, boom, bang, boom, boom, boom. Okay, weakness, check, take, take, step out the way, check, move, bang, knight outpost, knight takes, take, take, move, sacrifice, go back, and then, G1, garden dark squares, rook a check, the way, winning king trying to fight, creating open files for my rooks, king stepping forward the board, and then simply developing, taking pressure on these open files. Immediately moves her queen to defend this pawn. I'm immediately go to this, immediately go threaten this, try to take dark squares and put my pawn in the center of the board, telling this queen to move or just get a capture or a tempo. So, defends. I immediately move my king back to more safety. And I should have thought about staying on a light square, but I should have stayed in this light square and found a different move, but I couldn't find one, so I decided to go in sort of like a waiting move. Pawn to f4, and then elephant to a3, pawn to b6, rook to d1, putting a potentially putting out some discovery attacks, open up this file, challenging this rook if this king was over here, and trying to trade off on these rooks to simplify, or even keep both, I'm not sure. Throwing out some ideas. Pawn push, elephant takes the outpost, guarding both squares, attacking this pawn, this queen needs to defend it, goes on the opposite color lights, or pushes the pawn forward. a6, pawn to g3, offering another pawn chain to simplify the forward, open up the files, use the king to eventually get into a march or one of these two pawns to back up these pawn pushes and promotion eventually. Pawn takes, open up the file for my rook, a5, king g2, pawn a4, pawn a3, playing paraphyletic, stopping this pawn push, and then making, even if you decide to push, double take, making this beautiful anchor for my elephant. But this elephant could counter strike and potentially get a pass pawn, but my elephant guards that square, so that's amazing. Rook moves to the open file, trying to protect, overprotect the elephant. Rook d1, putting pressure on the ministers. King d5, sitting in the middle, doing everything, going back to put pressure on this king, potentially getting a discover check and a skewer, potentially. King moves out the way, doesn't want any problems. Rook lift to h5. And then we're going to do some moves. Move. I'm going to probably go to around move 50. Simplifying, rook endgame, king. And he is. We are equal pawn material, but he have an isolated pawn. My rooks are always able to go around and defend this pawn. And also, it's promoting to a mistress, not a good piece. So it's a 2-to-1 pawn majority with a rook on the 7th rank, rook on the 6th rank. Now absolutely dominating the position. So, pawn push. Rook g8, king f3, king to b2, trying to attack my pawn and go for a pawn race. Rook to d3, adding protection, willing to sacrifice the rook to protect his pawn. Or willing to just simply put pressure. And now, wait, no, not defending the pawn so the king cannot take. My mistake. Rook c3, offering a rook trade. I do the rook trade, takes. An extra move to get to this pawn that king has to waste. Simplifying. Rook to b7, trying to using a Fyodor-like method, Fyodor's type position to get behind the pawn chain to make a dangerous threat. King to c4 defending, pawn to f5 defending. Rook to e8, getting into open file on the e file. Rook to b6, going down, not taking this pawn and putting pressure on this pawn, so this rook is forced to defend, and finding a way to defend by moving back and playing passively. Rook f8. King e4, gaining direct opposition. Stopping this king from moving. I'm stopping the king from moving. Unless on this dark square or that dark square. Rook e8 check. I block with the rook. Rook moves out the way because it doesn't want to simplify. King goes back into cover. Direct opposition to the king. Then I simply go and say, if you're going to take my pawn, I'm going to take your pawn. And simplify even further. Rook goes down. Rook takes check. King takes. Rook to b7. Rook in the 7th and 6th ranks. A lot to win the game. Rook d2. Rook f7. And then simply just trying to liquidate. My opponent trying to use a Fyodor-like position. Maybe he should have pushed his pawn to the 1st rank to try to do that better. And then stopping that by attacking the rook, getting the king active. King does the same thing, moving the rook, saying, hey, you cannot come after me. Rook takes pawn. King b4. Rook to e6, guarding this entire file, always in getting a 2-move basis around, so if this pawn pushes here, I'm going to always go to this last rank and always get behind this pawn, or even go like this, get directly behind it, because the king has to escort the pawn unless this pawn is able to get this rook to the 2nd rank. So, pawn push, pawn push, pawn push, pawn push. King moves to try to gain opposition. Pawn push, king chase my rook. Rook moves back to get protected by the king. King tries to put pressure on my rook. I push pawn. Rook g2. King takes rook. King takes rook. Pawn race. King moves up. Direct opposition. Simple flank opposition. Direct opposition. Direct opposition. Flank opposition. Direct opposition. Flank opposition. Pawn push. And then convert these 2 pawns into a maciste. And then I march my king down the board. And I eventually walk down, take the center, and grab the final pawn, win by a rock pacha. And that's how I won. I have no idea. And took 87 move game. I'm satisfied. I enjoyed this. And let me see if I have any other notes. And let's talk about, as you saw, I sacrificed the minor piece to create double pawns. Even though I was down material, the opponent's pawn became strong and blocked their own my own chariots. And I used my rooks to dominate new open fires, cracking by that sacrifice. The marathon endgame is this: I removed material and cleaned every pace while protecting my own pawns. I needed my king as an active attacker to shepherd my pawns to the 8th rank, and I used a Babaja and underhand shot to take all the opponent's pieces to path to victory without a formal checkmate. And then I just saw the 4 divisions, explaining that the aspect for. I tell the viewers that originally it was an 8x8 by a race-like game of pawn races, and this was probably the original idea for pawn promotion and pawn races in the long term. Mine said I wasn't racing the center, I was occupying the center to deny the enemy moving so I can promote into these 2 mistresses, queens, to even if I wasn't able to get this pawn to get a eventual force checkmate by these 2 pieces. Used to be a ministry, you could only move 1 square diagonally. So in my game I kept it near the king, And the ancient world is the bodyguard, not wrongly the assassin, and that's why I maintain much tension. The wing doesn't have to bail me out of a bad position. And I run by that in Chaturanga, and I didn't need a checkmate. I just took by every single opponent's all their pieces. That is a shot strategy. Surgical movement and the ability to fight back until only their commander remains. So, hope you guys learned something. I enjoyed this scene. This was really positional, fun, and challenging for me to learn. Like, comment, subscribe, and goodbye. Thank you, gentlemen.